For decades, the global narrative has revolved around two superpowers, the United States and China. Their rivalry has defined the contours of global economics, military alliances, and political ideologies. Trade wars, technology bans, diplomatic visits, sanctions, summits, every twist and turn is broadcast in real time, painting a picture of a world caught between two giants. But beneath this loud and theatrical struggle, a quieter movement has taken root. One that hasn't made headlines with dramatic confrontations or grandiose statements, but one that might reshape the future of global trade in ways neither Washington nor Beijing anticipated. In the heart of Southeast Asia, 10 nations diverse in culture, language, and history have begun to emerge not just as a region of promise, but as a central force in a new global trade order. Together, they are ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For years, ASEAN was viewed as a passive player more interested in regional integration than geopolitical ambition. But things have changed, and the world, preoccupied with the binary clash between the US and China, is starting to take notice. Because while the US was embroiled in internal debates and foreign policy reversals, while China was expanding its Belt and Road ambitions, often drawing criticism and suspicion, ASEAN was making moves, quietly, deliberately, strategically. It signed trade agreements with partners across the globe. It deepened its connectivity, both digital and physical. It became the beating heart of supply chains rerouted by pandemics and politics. And most significantly, it took center stage in RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade agreement in history, covering nearly a third of the global economy. Not only did ASEAN help broker it, it is the glue that holds it together. Meanwhile, the United States, the architect of many of the world's existing trade frameworks, pulled back. In 2017, it exited the Trans-Pacific Partnership, signaling a shift toward protectionism and unpredictability. In doing so, it left a vacuum, one that ASEAN, and to a certain extent China, were more than willing to fill. This isn't a story of aggression or betrayal. This is a story of momentum, of how a region long overshadowed by its larger neighbors is now quietly becoming the center of gravity for trade, connectivity, and influence in the Indo-Pacific. So the question arises, is ASEAN leaving the United States behind? Not because it set out to, but because it couldn't afford to wait. In a world defined by speed, pragmatism, and economic interdependence, ASEAN is choosing to lead by building consensus, forging new ties, and focusing on growth, not conflict. This is the story of how power shifts not with a bang, but with a rebalancing. A tale of how Washington's absence may have given rise to an unexpected leader in global trade. ASEAN is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. It's setting the agenda, and the world is beginning to listen. How a once fractured region became the keystone of the Indo-Pacific trade system for much of the late 20th century. ASEAN was viewed less as a player and more as a venue, a geopolitical backdrop where larger powers came to court influence. Its member nations, from Indonesia to the Philippines, were often seen as recipients of aid, manufacturing hubs, or pawns in broader Cold War strategies. Few predicted that the region would evolve into a trade powerbroker capable of influencing the economic direction of not just Asia, but the entire world. And yet, that's exactly what has happened. But this transformation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, built brick by brick through infrastructure, diplomacy, reforms, and resilience. The numbers tell a new story. Today, ASEAN represents more than 680 million people, a combined GDP exceeding $3.6 trillion, and the fifth largest economy in the world. More than just numbers, ASEAN is strategically located at the intersection of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, making it the central node of global maritime trade. The Strait of Malacca alone handles nearly a quarter of global trade shipments. It's no exaggeration to say, if global trade were a bloodstream, ASEAN is its beating heart, and global investors are noticing. Over the past decade, foreign direct investment (FDI) into the region has grown rapidly, even surpassing China in several years. Multinational corporations, especially from Japan, South Korea, the EU, and yes, even the United States, are setting up regional headquarters in cities like Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, and Ho Chi Minh City. But how did ASEAN pull this off? From internal chaos to strategic unity. Rewind a few decades, and the story was very different. ASEAN was founded in 1967 during the height of the Cold War, not as an economic force, but as a political bloc meant to foster regional stability amid ideological tensions. Its early years were marked by mistrust, authoritarian regimes, and developmental gaps. From Cambodia's civil war to Indonesia's transition from dictatorship to democracy, the region often appeared unstable. Yet something changed in the 1990s. After surviving the Asian financial crisis of 1997, ASEAN nations began a slow, deliberate transformation. The crisis exposed the dangers of weak institutions, loose regulation, and overdependence on Western capital. In its wake, ASEAN doubled down on regional cooperation, leading to the creation of initiatives like the ASEAN Free Trade Area (FTA). The Chiang Mai Initiative for Currency Swaps, the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, the region's central philosophy, ASEAN centrality, emerge as both a vision and a strategy. Rather than allow larger powers to dictate the terms, ASEAN positioned itself as the hub of diplomacy, negotiation, and trade within Asia. And that's when the real shift began. The silent rise of multilateralism. While much of the West turned inward during the 2010s, focused on populist movements, immigration debates, and post-crisis recovery, ASEAN was quietly forging trade deals. It signed agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand under the ASEAN Plus 6 framework. Then, in 2020, after 8 years of negotiations, ASEAN became the driving force behind RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade agreement in history. RCEP now encompasses 30% of global GDP, 28% of global trade, 15 participating countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. What's remarkable? The United States is not part of it. ASEAN didn't just participate in this historic deal, it anchored it. Without ASEAN, RCEP would likely have collapsed under the weight of Sino-Japanese or Sino-Indian tensions. But ASEAN's neutrality and commitment to consensus created the space for negotiation. It was a clear signal to the world. ASEAN was no longer content to be the stage, it was now writing the script. The US misses the party. Contrast this with the US strategy during the same period. In 2017, the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP), a trade pact that had been designed, in part, to counterbalance China's influence in Asia. The US exit sent shockwaves through allies and partners who had hoped for stronger American engagement in the region. Meanwhile, ASEAN moved forward. The remaining TPP members formed the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Without the United States and ASEAN, always pragmatic, worked to balance both China and the West, maintaining trade relations with all while avoiding alignment with any one side. This diplomatic balancing act wasn't easy, but it was effective. From bystander to broker, so where does that leave us? ASEAN has transitioned from passive participant to regional architect. Its infrastructure plans, trade agreements, and neutrality now make it the preferred middle ground for negotiations, whether it's about tech, tariffs, or even territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Countries like Vietnam and Indonesia are being actively courted by both US and Chinese delegations. Thailand is being eyed as a potential battery and EV manufacturing hub. Singapore continues to dominate in finance and logistics. The truth is simple: ASEAN is indispensable to any serious Indo-Pacific strategy. And yet, the United States, despite its economic size and historic influence, seems to be playing catch-up, struggling to re-enter a game whose rules are now being written in Jakarta, Hanoi, and Manila. How Southeast Asia led the largest trade pact in history and left the US out in the quiet of a virtual summit on November 15, 2020. 15 countries pressed a button that echoed across the global economic order. That click signified the signing of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It was the largest free trade agreement the world had ever seen, a deal covering 30% of global GDP, 2.2 billion people, and a market value that dwarfed even NAFTA and the EU. But what caught headlines wasn't just the size of the agreement. It was who wasn't at the table: the United States. A pact born in complexity, RCEP wasn't a response to one event, it was the result of nearly a decade of negotiation, frustration, and regional ambition. What started as an ASEAN initiative in 2012 evolved into a multilateral epic. The goals were pragmatic: simplify overlapping trade agreements, reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers, harmonize rules of origin, create a single framework covering goods, services, investment, e-commerce, and intellectual property. But the process was anything but smooth. China and Japan struggled to agree on investment protections. India withdrew in 2019 over concerns of Chinese goods flooding its markets, and Australia faced diplomatic hostilities with Beijing. In the middle of this tug-of-war stood ASEAN, not as a referee, but as the anchor. Its members provided the institutional credibility, the political neutrality, and the shared urgency to finalize the deal. Without ASEAN's role as convener, mediator, and consensus builder, RCEP would have likely failed. Why it matters: RCEP isn't just a trade deal, it's a geopolitical signal. China, the region's largest trading partner, gained greater access to markets and legitimized its role in rulemaking. Japan and South Korea deepened ties with Southeast Asia, mitigating their dependency on China. Australia and New Zealand, once distant players, now had an institutional foothold in Asia's economic core. And ASEAN, it placed itself at the very center of this arrangement, shaping rules and setting the tone for how the Indo-Pacific trades, invests, and interacts. This wasn't just about reducing tariffs, it was about building a regional identity with ASEAN at the helm. The US watches from afar. Back in Washington, the tone was different. Just 4 years earlier, under President Obama, the US had championed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, designed as a bulwark against Chinese trade dominance. But in 2017, under President Trump, the US abruptly withdrew, branding multilateral deals as threats to American workers. The exit was more than symbolic, it left a vacuum, one that China and ASEAN were all too ready to fill. When RCEP was signed in 2020, it wasn't just a deal, it was a quiet verdict. Southeast Asia could move forward without the US. It would have been unthinkable in the 1990s, but now, it was reality. Even long-standing US allies, like Japan and Australia, chose to sign the agreement with China as part of their own hedging strategy against US unpredictability. And for ASEAN, this was more than strategic positioning. It was validation. For years, ASEAN had been dismissed as slow, consensus-bound, or too fragmented to lead. RCEP proved the opposite. In an age of rising nationalism and broken multilateralism, ASEAN's patient diplomacy worked. Substance over symbolism. Critics of RCEP in the West were quick to downplay its impact. They called it shallow, lacking the labor protections and environmental standards of TPP. And in some ways, they were right. RCEP is less ambitious in scope, focusing more on trade facilitation than deep regulatory alignment. But ASEAN didn't need another platinum standard deal. It needed a realistic framework, one that included China, Japan, and South Korea in the same tent, offered investment certainty to small and mid-sized firms, respected development gaps between Cambodia and Singapore, Laos and Vietnam. In that light, RCEP was a masterpiece of pragmatism, and ASEAN knew what it was doing. It wasn't trying to replace the US, it was creating a trade architecture that would work regardless of who sat in the White House, a test of US relevance. In Washington, policymakers now face a growing concern. If Southeast Asia continues to move forward with regional frameworks that exclude the US, how long until American influence fades altogether? Already, ASEAN nations trade more with China than with the US. In some countries, Chinese digital infrastructure, telecom equipment, and lending dominate. Meanwhile, US presence is often symbolic: military bases, defense pacts, or diplomatic statements without economic muscle. And this is the heart of the dilemma. In a region that prizes infrastructure, jobs, and access to markets, influence doesn't come from ideals. It comes from trade, technology, and tangible investment. That's the game ASEAN is playing. And right now, the US isn't even on the field. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is Washington's comeback, but is it too little, too late? In May 2022, US President Joe Biden stood in Tokyo and announced America's return to the Indo-Pacific economic arena. The speech was carefully worded. The venue, Japan, was symbolic, and the initiative, a brand new framework called IPEF, The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. It was hailed by Washington as a new chapter in U.S. economic engagement, a reimagined trade strategy that avoided the political baggage of old-style free trade agreements. But for many watching in Southeast Asia, the question wasn't about the branding. It was, what took you so long? A framework without a backbone. At first glance, IPEF sounds impressive. It involves 14 countries, including major ASEAN players like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand. It covers about 40% of global GDP. It targets modern challenges like clean energy transition, supply chain resilience, tax and anti-corruption, digital trade and data governance. Unlike RCEP or the defunct TPP, IPEF isn't a trade agreement. There are no tariff reductions, no market access guarantees, no legally binding commitments that exporters and investors can rely on. For ASEAN economies that still rely heavily on merchandise trade, this was a letdown. In short, IPEF promised rules without rewards. ASEAN's mixed reactions. The initial ASEAN response was polite but cautious. Countries like Vietnam and Indonesia welcomed the US back into the regional fold. But beneath the surface, skepticism lingered. Here's why. No tariff incentives. Without access to the vast US consumer market, what's in it for ASEAN manufacturers? Unclear benefits. IPEF's working groups are still negotiating details. Many nations are unsure what commitments they are being asked to make. Political uncertainty. Given the polarized US political climate, what happens if the next administration withdraws again? This last point hits hardest. Trust once broken is hard to rebuild. When the US pulled out of TPP, it not only abandoned a trade pact, it left behind a trail of broken promises, especially to Vietnam and Malaysia, who had reformed laws and labor codes to comply. IPEF is Washington's apology letter, but ASEAN wants action, not just acknowledgement. RCEP's pragmatic appeal, by contrast, RCEP delivers. It may not have ambitious climate clauses or digital rule sets, but it does one thing very well: simplify trade. A factory in Thailand making car parts for export to South Korea, or a Vietnamese tech firm importing Japanese microchips, can now operate under a single set of rules of origin. This lowers costs, boosts transparency, and creates predictable business conditions. And crucially, RCEP's rules are binding. They can be enforced. Businesses can plan around them. In the RCEP world, trade facilitation is the currency of trust. In the IPEF world, trust is still waiting to be printed. Digital divide and data dominance. Another key fault line between IPEF and RCEP lies in the digital economy. IPEF, reflecting US values, aims to promote open cross-border data flows, strong consumer protection, source code transparency. This aligns well with developed countries like Japan and South Korea. But for many ASEAN nations, digital sovereignty remains a sensitive topic. Countries like Vietnam and Indonesia are still building their data infrastructure, enforcing local content rules, and managing cybersecurity concerns. There is resistance to handing over control of digital ecosystems to external players, and this gives China an edge. Under the digital Silk Road, Chinese firms are building cloud services, installing undersea cables, providing fintech infrastructure, offering e-commerce platforms tailored to local conditions. ASEAN digital policy is still fragmented. While the US is pushing for principles, China is providing products, and that's hard to ignore. A tale of two-trade logics at its core. The clash between IPEF and RCEP reflects two very different visions of economic diplomacy. IPEF, rule-centric, values-driven, tech-forward, but vague and non-binding. RCEP, commerce-centric, minimalist in ambition, but concrete, enforceable, and led from within the region. ASEAN, once again, finds itself in the middle. And so far, it's playing both sides, a little IPEF here, a little RCEP there. That as the global trade order continues to fragment, this balancing act may soon become harder to maintain. The clock is ticking for the US. IPEF is a chance to regain lost credibility, but time is not on Washington's side. China is deepening its foothold, not just economically, but culturally and diplomatically. ASEAN is becoming bolder, crafting its own regional norms and asserting its voice. Global supply chains are shifting, and those who shape the rules now will control the flows tomorrow. If IPEF remains toothless, and the US continues to hesitate, it's not just influence that America will lose, it's relevance. ASEAN doesn't need to choose China. Geography already did. If trade were just about numbers, China would have already won. In 2022, China was the largest trading partner of every ASEAN member state. The numbers are staggering. $975 billion in total trade between ASEAN and China. 30% of ASEAN's total trade volume now involves Chinese ports. Over 4,000 Chinese companies operate across Southeast Asia. This isn't just trade. It's integration, but China's economic footprint isn't just large. It's strategic and increasingly hard to disentangle. Built by China, walk through a port in Cambodia, a high-speed rail station in Laos, or a 5G tower in Malaysia, and you're likely standing on Chinese investment. Under the Belt and Road Initiative BRI, China has poured over $200 billion into Southeast Asia. Roads, bridges, power plants, fiber optic cables, it's a long list. Some projects have sparked controversy, others have fallen behind schedule or drawn debt trap warnings. But most of them got built and built fast. Compare this to the West's infrastructure offerings: slow-moving, filtered through environmental review boards, and often more promises than progress. For ASEAN countries hungry for connectivity and growth, speed matters, and China delivers. Money talks, and stays. China's financial tools go far beyond asphalt and steel. Through state banks, it offers low-interest loans and direct investments. Through fintech platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay, it's digitizing small business ecosystems. Through e-commerce titans like Alibaba, it's enabling local entrepreneurs to sell across borders. This isn't just commerce, it's ecosystem dominance. And ASEAN countries aren't just recipients, they're participants. Vietnamese engineers are coding for Chinese cloud firms. Thai logistics companies are integrating with Alibaba's delivery network. Indonesian fintech startups are partnering with Ant Financial. This is no longer a simple exporter-importer relationship, it's mutual adaptation. Soft power in hard times. China's influence isn't limited to money. When COVID-19 struck, China was among the first to deliver vaccines to Laos, Cambodia, and Indonesia, even as Western nations hoarded supplies. Medical teams and masks when healthcare systems were collapsing. Tech for contact tracing and pandemic response. This created narratives of solidarity crafted carefully through Chinese media partnerships and local influencers. In contrast, the West's outreach often arrived late and with political strings attached. The result? While trust in Beijing's long-term intentions may remain cautious, trust in its capacity to act is rising. Strategic realism. Western analysts often frame ASEAN's tilt toward China as a failure of values, a compromise of liberal ideals for short-term gain. But within ASEAN capitals, the logic is different. It's not about choosing China, it's about managing reality. China is next door, a fact that won't change. It is too big to ignore and too integrated to exclude. And it is playing a long game, one that sees Southeast Asia not as a battleground, but as a backyard. For many ASEAN leaders, pragmatism trumps ideology. They don't have the luxury of idealism. They need investment now, growth now, vaccines now, infrastructure now. And China is offering that now. The security trade-off, of course, it's not all roses. The South China Sea remains a major flashpoint, with China's expansive maritime claims clashing directly with the sovereignty of countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. ASEAN navies are wary. ASEAN diplomats walk a tightrope. U.S. military presence in the region is still considered essential both as a deterrent and as a balancer, but this creates a strange duality. ASEAN wants China's money, but America's muscle. It wants Chinese connectivity, but U.S. counterweight. It speaks of ASEAN centrality, but navigates between two giants. This is not betrayal, it is survival. China's grand strategy. So what does China want? The answer is not domination, it's deference. It wants ASEAN to operate within its economic orbit. It wants to rewrite trade rules through RCEP and CPTPP. It wants U.S. influence to fade, not through war, but through irrelevance. And most of all, it wants no bloc formations, no united front that excludes Beijing. It prefers bilateralism so that it can exert tailored influence, country by country, deal by deal. This is why China welcomes ASEAN's non-alignment. It suits Beijing's playbook perfectly. Because in a fragmented field, the strongest player always wins. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. ASEAN chose the latter and is now shaping the future of trade. For decades, ASEAN was seen as a geopolitical lightweight, more a talking shop than a force. It issued joint statements, held annual summits, and carefully avoided stepping on superpower toes. But quietly, methodically, ASEAN was building something more enduring than headlines. It was building architecture. And now, that architecture is starting to shape not only regional trade but global norms. The institutional web, what set ASEAN apart from many regional groupings, is its dense network of agreements and frameworks. From the ASEAN Free Trade Area (FTA) to the ASEAN Economic Community (AEC), the bloc has painstakingly created rules, norms, and dispute mechanisms that give structure to Southeast Asia's growth. But the real game changer came with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest free trade deal, covering 30% of global GDP and 2.2 billion people, spearheaded not by the US or China but by ASEAN. Yes, China joined. And yes, the deal favors its industrial scale. But the negotiations, the framework, the consensus building all originated in ASEAN's playbook. RCEP is proof that ASEAN is no longer content with reacting, it's initiating. From rule takers to rule makers in trade, rules are power. For years, Southeast Asia was at the mercy of WTO rules set by the West or bilateral deals imposed by larger economies. But with RCEP, and potentially CPTPP next, ASEAN is moving from rule taker to rule maker. Here's what that shift looks like. ASEAN sets regional standards on digital trade, environmental rules, and labor mobility. ASEAN aligns customs procedures and harmonizes regulations, reducing frictions across borders. ASEAN becomes the go-to platform for economic diplomacy between powers that otherwise won't meet directly. When the US wants to engage China but not look weak, it does so through an ASEAN forum. When Japan wants to hedge against Beijing but preserve trade, it leans on ASEAN structures. ASEAN becomes the stage, not just an actor. Strategic ambiguity as strength. Many mistake ASEAN's reluctance to pick sides as indecision. In reality, it is deliberate ambiguity, a strategy that has allowed the bloc to extract value from both superpowers without fully submitting to either. From the US, ASEAN gets security cooperation, technology transfers, and defense diplomacy. From China, it receives infrastructure, trade, and market access. And from both, it demands respect for its centrality. This balancing act is encoded in the so-called ASEAN Way, a consensus-driven, non-confrontational approach to diplomacy. Critics say this slows decision-making. Supporters say it's the only reason ASEAN has survived and thrived amid chaos. In a world torn between ideological camps, ASEAN's refusal to play ideological games is not a weakness, it's a shield. Trade-first foreign policy, unlike the West, which often leads with values, or China, which leads with scale, ASEAN leads with trade. For ASEAN leaders, trade is not an outcome of foreign policy, it is foreign policy. The Philippines courts foreign investors as aggressively as it courts allies. Vietnam signs FTAs with both the EU and China in the same breath. Indonesia reforms labor laws not for domestic politics, but to unlock Japanese and Korean investment. Even when political tensions flare like Myanmar's internal crisis, ASEAN has sought economic continuity over punitive sanctions. It's a controversial approach, but one that keeps the economic engine humming. Digital trade and the new ASEAN frontier. As the physical infrastructure boom gives way to the digital era, ASEAN is already shifting gears. Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam are leading in e-commerce integration and cross-border payment systems. Digital economy agreements are being piloted across the region with an eye toward building a shared ASEAN digital marketplace. Regional discussions are underway for data sovereignty, AI governance, and cybersecurity cooperation. While the West debates regulation and China tightens state control, ASEAN is positioning itself as a flexible, innovation-friendly middle ground. This opens the door for Western tech firms seeking alternatives to China, Chinese platforms looking to expand without hitting Western walls, local startups to scale beyond national borders under common rules. It's not just trade anymore. ASEAN is shaping the future of how trade is done. ASEAN's moment. Many believe ASEAN is still playing a secondary role in the global order, but that may be a misread. ASEAN doesn't need to dominate headlines, it dominates corridors of influence. It doesn't project power, it channels it. And in a fragmented, multipolar world, channeling power may matter more than wielding it. As superpowers lock horns and alliances fray, the world may look increasingly unstable. But in the middle of that turbulence, a quiet, pragmatic, often underestimated bloc is charting a different course, one trade agreement, one summit, one infrastructure project at a time. And it's starting to look like the rest of the world is following its lead. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Mark Twain. As ASEAN moves deeper into a new trade-driven era, one increasingly influenced by China's proximity and ASEAN's own initiatives, the question now becomes urgent. Can the United States catch up? Can Washington, after years of retreat and strategic distraction, re-establish itself not just as a security guarantor but as an economic partner of first resort? This isn't just a diplomatic question. It's existential for both ASEAN and America's long-term role in the Indo-Pacific, the ghost of TPP. To understand the scale of Washington's challenge, we must go back to the moment many analysts cite as the beginning of America's economic disengagement, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP) in 2017. It was supposed to be America's boldest economic strategy in Asia, 12-nation trade pact designed not just to boost trade, but to set rules on labor, environment, and digital governance that would constrain China's economic behavior. But with a single executive order, the US pulled out, and in doing so, it ceded leadership of regional trade norms to others. It alienated allies who had negotiated in good faith. It undermined trust in American economic commitment. In response, the remaining countries led by Japan pressed forward and rebranded the deal as CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The US was left out. China applied to join, a stunning reversal. IPEF. Too little, too late. In 2022, the Biden administration attempted a reset with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework (IPEF). It promised supply chain resilience, fair digital trade, clean energy cooperation, anti-corruption standards. But there was a glaring hole: no market access, no tariff cuts, no meaningful trade concessions, no actual entry into US markets. For ASEAN economies that thrive on exports, this was not a real substitute for TPP. It was diplomacy dressed as economics. Many ASEAN leaders welcomed the symbolism, but behind closed doors, there was skepticism. If the US doesn't put trade on the table, one Southeast Asian official reportedly said, why should we take them seriously? The China factor. Meanwhile, China was moving fast. It wasn't just investing, it was embedding itself in ASEAN economies. Railways and roads from Laos to Malaysia, port acquisitions in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Myanmar, digital infrastructure deals with Chinese cloud providers and telecom giants. And perhaps most importantly, China kept buying. Despite political tensions, ASEAN remained China's largest trading partner for consecutive years. China offers access, scale, and speed. The US offers norms, rights, and caution. For many ASEAN nations hungry for growth, impatient with bureaucracy, the choice is complicated, but increasingly leaning eastward. What the US must do if Washington is serious about reclaiming economic ground in ASEAN, it must go beyond strategic ambiguity and symbolic frameworks. Here's what it would take. 1. Rejoin or rival CPTPP. Whether through rejoining CPTPP or proposing an equally ambitious framework with real market access, the US must show up with actual trade benefits, not just lectures. 2. Localize supply chains. Shift China Plus One strategies toward ASEAN. Encourage US companies to build manufacturing hubs in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This creates mutual dependency and jobs. 3. Fund digital infrastructure. Compete with China's digital Silk Road by funding neutral, secure alternatives in cloud computing, AI, and 5G networks. Not just to challenge China but to give ASEAN choices. 4. Empower the private sector. Let American tech, logistics, and finance firms lead the way. ASEAN doesn't want aid, they want access to capital, talent, and technology. 5. Listen first, lead later. ASEAN countries value respect and partnership, not being told what to do. Washington must engage as a listener, not a savior. The clock is ticking. Unlike the Cold War era, today's geopolitical alignment is not about ideology alone. It's about connectivity, markets, and opportunity. If Washington delays, it may find that ASEAN has already settled into new habits, with new partners and new systems that no longer need American validation. And once economic dependency shifts, strategic loyalty often follows. America's military presence in the Pacific will remain vital. But without economic integration, it risks becoming a hollow core defending interests that no longer exist in markets it no longer dominates. A second chance, despite missteps, the US still holds significant cards: cultural influence, elite education pipelines, innovative tech ecosystem, and most of all, an alternative to authoritarian economics. Southeast Asia does not want to be a Chinese satellite, nor does it want to be caught in a proxy war. It wants balance, agency, and growth. If the US can deliver those consistently, not just rhetorically, it might still find a seat at ASEAN's economic table, but that window is closing fast. For decades, global trade was dominated by superpowers, nations whose strength could bend markets, shape treaties, and dictate the rules of commerce. The United States wrote the rules, China challenged them. But something is shifting. Quietly, persistently, the gravitational center of trade is moving. Not to another superpower, but to a region, to a coalition, to ASEAN. This collection of 10 nations, once seen as junior players in a game of giants, has begun rewriting the rules of engagement. Not with confrontation, but with connection. Not through dominance, but through diplomacy. Through trade corridors, infrastructure agreements, digital pacts, and regional integration, ASEAN is building its own architecture of influence. The United States, with all its power, is learning a hard truth: presence alone is not policy. You cannot lead a region you don't trade with. You cannot shape markets you won't open. You cannot win trust from behind a wall of tariffs and missed opportunities. China understands this. ASEAN understands this. Does Washington? This isn't the Cold War. The countries of Southeast Asia are not ideological battlegrounds, they are emerging centers of power, capable of choosing their own destinies. And increasingly, they are choosing partnerships of mutual benefit regardless of superpower preferences. In the end, perhaps the real story isn't that ASEAN is leaving the US behind. It's that ASEAN is moving forward with or without it. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who understands that global trade isn't just about numbers, it's about influence, alliances, and the future of global power. If you're as fascinated as we are by the rise of ASEAN, the shifting tides of economic leadership, and the fading dominance of traditional superpowers, then subscribe to this channel for weekly deep dives into global trade, geopolitics, and the economic chessboard shaping the 21st century. Like this video if you believe regions like Southeast Asia deserve more attention and more agency on the world stage. Comment below, do you think the US can regain its footing in ASEAN? Or has China already won the economic future of Southeast Asia? And don't forget to turn on notifications, because the next trade deal, summit, or infrastructure pact could rewrite the world map, and you lines want to be the first to understand what it really means. The future isn't coming, it's already here. And it may no longer speak only English or Mandarin. It may speak Thai, Vietnamese, Bahasa, and Tagalog. Welcome to the age of ASEAN.